You wear multiple identities as a novelist. You are an Indian English novelist. Over the last 3 decades, as you said, that you have fair exposure to the West as well. Those themes appear in the novel, and yet you are deeply rooted in a geography called Bengal.
And that's what makes me so sad about what's happened, to the universities now. Because really, these were world-class places. And, now they're being systematically destroyed. And it just makes you realize that, it's very easy to tear something down, but to build it is so very difficult. If it were not for my experience of living in, predominantly black neighborhood in New York, you suddenly begin to understand that we in India really always have tried to not confront the fundamental reality of race in the building of the British Empire. With modernity as well, we see so many. It's only now, say because of climate change, that we are suddenly becoming aware of how destructive, that model of so-called development was. That it created ways of life that are completely unsustainable and that will collapse.
Hello, welcome to this episode of Samvad. We have a distinguished guest today, a great novelist whose novels have shown us a new vision to look at the world around us, as well as a remarkable essayist who has dealt with a range of themes in his essays ranging from climate change to migration. He is a unique storyteller in the sense that he is not satiated with one genre, and the themes which remain unaccomplished in one form, say the novel, find an easy denouement in the other, that is the essay. And he is with us today because his new book, Wild Fictions, a collection of essays, is recently out. Welcome to Samvad. Thank you so much, Amitav, to be here.
Thank you, Ashutosh. It's a great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Amitav, this book reflects all the major themes that have obsessed you over the last 3 decades or so. But before we come to this book, let me ask a bit about your primary vocation, that is a novelist. As you have noted again and again here and elsewhere, that the novelist now is no longer tied to the desk. They undertake elaborate journeys, do deep research into subjects like history, geography, botany. What has accounted for this change in the life of a novelist and the vocation of a novelist?
I would say, first of all, that it's not the case that novelists were ever tied to their desks, really. Because if you look at, say, Herman Melville, Melville used to do extensive research. His Moby Dick is based upon his interviews with, it's based upon a true story.
The whale story, right?
Yeah,
right.
It's based on the story of the whale ship Essex. Actually, there's been a very good film about it also. But Herman Melville did extensive research, even more than Melville. John Steinbeck, when he was writing The Grapes of Wrath, he did a lot of research amongst migrant communities, agricultural workers, agricultural camps in California. So all of that was based on research. It was not at all just, written sitting at a desk. In our country, Sunil Gangopadhyay, who was a very dear friend of mine, he always also did a lot of research. So it's quite common, it's not I would say it's a mistake to imagine that, writers just sit at their desks. And certainly, for me too, Naipaul also did a lot of research. So I think it's not unusual.
But the kind of research you now see, say in historical novels, for instance, say Gora and Anandamath, they're also historical novels by Tagore and Bankim. But the historical novels that we now read, do you see they are in a continuum, or there is some difference the way writers now conceive their novels?
I don't think you can call Gora really a historical novel. But Gora is actually, when you read it, it's like a long argument. That's what's very interesting about Gora. It's like it's a novel of rhetoric, where he's actually imagining this argument, about what it means to be Indian or non-Indian or whatever, and nature versus nurture, all of that. So it's a very interesting novel of ideas, rather than a historical novel, I would say. But with Bunkim, it's quite different. Bunkim was a real intellectual, and in a way that, and a scholar, in a way that Tagore was. I mean, he's very different from Tagore in that sense. So Bunkim was definitely doing a lot, doing the kind of research that was possible at the time.
Back then.
Yes.
So when you mentioned Moby Dick and John Steinbeck's novel, do you see them as an exception in that era? Because now what I see in the last 3 or 4 decades or so, there is more and more focus on historical novels. The era of a lonely individual confronting against his or her own soul, that great adventure which we saw, say, in Dostoevsky or Camus, or even Nirmal Verma, for instance, back home, that seems to be over. Do you at least agree on this?
No, I wouldn't say so at all. In fact, I would say that now more than ever, novels tend to be very individualized, and basically, the big trend in fiction now, at least in the West, tends to be trauma fiction. People writing about the individual traumas and how they live past it. There's a kind of very intense psychologization of the novel. I'm not sure that has happened quite so much in India, but it has actually also happened here. I think the big difference that I see, when I was, say, your age or younger, the Indian writers of that generation were very profoundly engaged with issues of environment. Mahashweta Devi, for example, Gopinath Mohanty, Poroja, was very much engaged with the forests of Odisha. So many of the, especially the writers in Kannada, were very engaged with these issues. Now there's a huge difference in that. I think you can say that 90% of the people who write, and I'm sure this is true also in Hindi and in Bangla, but certainly Indian writers in English, almost all write about urban issues. They're all urban based, writing about cities, writing about city life. So that's a huge difference that has appeared. And I think much more, in the 1960s, 70s, Indian writers were writing in a very, they were only writing about their own contexts. They were not really always responding to what was happening in the West or whatever. I think that has changed very much. There's a kind of globalization of taste, if you like, so that people now will be writing, even here, will be writing essentially the same kinds of books that people write in the West.
In the West.
Yeah.
Do you see there is some creative challenge when it comes to incorporating contemporary themes like climate change or migration or day-to-day politics into the realm of the novel? Issues that have already been written about, which are appearing on a daily basis in the media. How to address that on a creative plane?
I'm not well enough acquainted. You're talking about India.
India and your work as well. I mean, how do you address that? How to address a political or a theme which is contemporary? How to bring that into the novel?
Well, I think one writer that I've read recently who does this in a very powerful and interesting way is the Santhali writer Hansda Shekhar.
Right.
I've been very much impressed by his work. Again, he's very different from the other writers in that he's not writing about urban issues or whatever. He's very much writing about rural India, if you like, and so on. But especially the way that he evokes, the Santhali relationship with the land and how that relationship has also broken down. I think it's very powerful work.
I'll again stick to the novel and your novel. You wear multiple identities as a novelist. You are an Indian English novelist. You, over the last 3 decades, as you said, that you have fair exposure to the West as well. Those themes appear in the novel, and yet you are deeply rooted in a geography called Bengal. What find me fascinating about your work is that you do not make a distinction between West Bengal and Bangladesh. Somehow there appears to be a cultural and geographical continuum between these two entities. So I would like you to elaborate on that, because you were born in post-partition era in the 50s, and yet you have carried within you the memories of an undivided Bengal.
Yes, you're right. That is very true. And actually, the strange thing is that my family moved to India long before partition. You know, so we are not like partition people. And yet, in my families, in my mother's family and in my father's family, there was a very powerful sense of East Bengal. Of what life was like there. They talked about it all the time. So there was a profound sense of kind of a sort of connection with East Bengal. I think, the two parts of India that were divided, one is Bengal, one is Punjab. And the same feeling persists in Punjab also. I mean, so many Punjabis continue to feel that sense of connection, with the other Punjab. And I think it's very similar for us Bengalis. I think something that people in other parts of India don't really understand, and I've noticed this because of being in Goa, being elsewhere. For Goans, for example, even after they've been abroad or wherever they've been for generations, there's a sense of being linked to their ancestral temple or their ancestral church or wherever, various places, and they can return to it. What happens with those of us, Bengalis or Punjabis, who've been cut off from our ancestral roots, is that sense of connection is sort of permanently severed, Even though my mother's village still exists, I went there last year in January at exactly this time.
In Bangladesh.
In Bangladesh. It was very interesting to go. You're absolutely right. I mean, it's a kind of composite culture, but it's also, there are these geographical continuities. So, for example, the Sundarban, which is what I've been writing about for a long time, is the same on both sides of the border, So that ecological and geographical continuity is very present, in all our lives. You see it in the work of Tagore, for example, because even though he was from West Bengal, as it were, their ancestral properties were very much in East Bengal, so he spent a lot of his time there.
Right.
Yeah.
Ritu Ghatak Megha Dhaka Tara, he carried his East Bengal identity with him all along.
Exactly. So that remains, you can't, and it persists over generations, really.
Who are the Bengali novelists you consider as your immediate ancestors?
Well, have you heard of Sharadindu Bandyopadhyay? Sharadindu, completely by chance, I started reading him when I was in school. My Bengali teacher made us read Sharadindu, and the books are just completely wonderful. Young adult literature, as it would be called now. Historical, he has this character called, we say in Bengali, Sadashiv, which would be Sadashiv.
Sadashiv, right.
So there are these stories called Sadashivir Golpo. So this young sort of...
Fiction of Sadashiv Gulp, yeah.
So Sadashiv is a young recruit to the Maratha army and, follows Shivaji everywhere. Wonderful stories, like, adventure stories. But Sharadindu lived in Pune, that's where he grew up. So those stories were very important to me, at a certain point in my life. And I think they did a lot to sort of create my interest in history and in writing historical fiction. So certainly,
Sharadendu Bandyopadhyay.
Sharadindu Bandyopadhyay was a very, I mean, it's a strange thing to say, but there's a huge revival of Sharadindu now. They're having big conferences on his work and so on. So there was him, and of course I also read Bunkim, and I also read Ravi Thakur. So they were all there, but you know, there are a lot of other Bengali writers who I think people don't notice as much, except that now they're all also translated into English. There was a wonderful writer called Moti Nandi.
Moti Nandi.
Yeah, he's also been translated by Arunav.
Arunav Sinha.
Yeah. So Moti Nandi wrote these books about sport. You know, there were these two books called Striker and Stopper. You know, wonderful books about football. You know, and he wrote books about. He wrote a wonderful book about a young swimmer, a woman swimmer. He was a completely delightful writer. He's also, as I said, been translated by Arunavu. So, you know, at a certain point in my life, I can't even distinguish between what is in Bangla and what is in English. It's all in my head. You know, Sunil Gangopadhyay was a very close friend of Panishwarnath Renu. Because Panishwarnath Renu really, you know, Maithili and Bangla are so close,
yes, yes.
as it were. And there's always, Ravish, for example, you know. He speaks fluent Bangla, and he's also Maithil, I think.
He's a Maithili, yeah.
Yeah. And his wife is Bengali, I think, no?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Just like Rajkumar Jha, another Maithili Brahmin.
That's right. That's right. And Rajkumar speaks fluent Bangla also.
Right, Rajkumar speaks fluent Bangla.
Yeah. So through Shunilda, we used to hear so many stories about Panishwarnath Renu, and actually I read Panishwarnath Renu also, you know, and
in Hindi?
Yes, in Hindi. There was a time where actually even now I can read Hindi if I struggle. You know, so I read this. You know, there's a wonderful. When I was researching the Ibis trilogy, I came across this wonderful book by Madhukar Upadhyay.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know Madhukar
Yes,
Upadhyay
yes.
and his work? So there's this, the only thing written or said to be written by an Indian sepoy in the 19th century is it's a you might say it's a book, but it's actually sort of memoir. It's called Sitaram Subedar, you know, but it only exists in English because it's said to have been dictated to an English officer who wrote it down in English. It's the autobiography of a sepoy. It's a very interesting book. But Madhukar Upadhyay rewrote the English version in Awadhi. And I thought I would never be able to understand it. But actually, you know, it's much more fun to read Awadhi, to me at least, than to read Shuddha Hindi. Yes.
Oh,
yes.
Wonderful.
It's much more, you know, how shall I say, it's much more textured.
It has a different flavor altogether.
That's right.
But what surprises me about Renu as well, because Renu is not an easy writer in that sense, because he breaks syntax. To appreciate Renu requires, I'm delighted that you read Renu.
Not only that, if you read my book, The Calcutta Chromosome, it's full of references to Renu. You know, Renu has that wonderful story about a railway station. I loved that story, and it really spoke to me because there's something about, you know, Indian railway stations. There's a sort of hauntedness, you know, which Renu really captures.
Right.
So in that book, there's actually a place called Renupur, which I named after him.
I also find it insightful here in this book when you write that in my novels, family has replaced the nation. So as we know, the novel was a major instrument, a tool for nation building, for nationalism as well. But what you are suggesting, what I could infer, that maybe once the nation has been constructed, post-independence, the family takes the center stage. Does that what you mean to say?
I think what I was trying to say over there is, there is this American literary critic, a Marxist called Frederick Jameson.
Right.
And he made this famous argument saying that all third world novels
National allegories, right?
are national allegories, which
yeah.
I think is just so ridiculous,
Right,
you
right.
know. I mean, he was maybe thinking of Salman Rushdie, but of no other South Asian writer is that true. I mean, how do you say that the work of Mahashweta Devi is a national allegory? It's
Right,
ridiculous, you know. I mean, it's just a statement of a certain kind of ignorance, if you ask me. But I do think that in the work of many of us, whether we grew up here or not, the family does play a very, very major role. For example, even with, say, Naipaul's House for Mr. Biswas, it's basically, it revolves around our family structures. And that's certainly been the case for a lot of my own work.
Coming to Jamison's remark, which you just made, how has it colored the Western view to the subcontinental literature? That I want to know from you. How influential was he in determining how the West should reciprocate or respond to the literature that's emerging from this part of the world?
He was very influential. And that's the extraordinary thing. He was very influential, and he really formed their ideas about writing from India and elsewhere. And I think he did a terrible disservice, to our work. And it's such a strange thing, because there he is being a Marxist and all that. And he completely didn't understand at all what we are doing. And in fact, in the writing of so many Western critics, I think there's a complete incomprehension, of our work, really. When I first, my books first started coming out in the, let's say, late 80s, early 90s, it was very striking. I mean, the Western critics, they would say, oh, these poor third world writers, they always have to write about politics because, they have no inner lives and they can't imagine, the interior states and so on. But it's very striking that from 2016 onwards, as soon as Trump appeared on the scene, all American writers immediately started writing about politics. They gave up all their nonsense and started writing about, So that whole thing flipped on its head completely, Suddenly this whole idea that only third world writers write about politics, it just completely changed. In reality, Western taste was completely shaped by geopolitics.
Yes.
So from the 50s onwards, under the instigation of the CIA, they created this whole new school of writing, which they call creative writing and so on. So University of Iowa was a prime example, where essentially to combat, a Soviet social realism, they created an alternative school, which is very highly depoliticized. It's all about interiority. It's all about emotional states. And I think that's the real enigma, of let's say, especially Western literature in the late 20th century, the degree to which it's shaped by geopolitics, especially geopolitical interventions from intelligence agencies and so on. But even beyond that, for example, Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, they hated Steinbeck. And the reason they hated Steinbeck is because Steinbeck was writing about poverty. Mm-hmm. And he was writing about a side of American life that they didn't like. André Gide, the
great French writer, yeah.
Yeah. He once wrote a positive review of Steinbeck. And he records there that all his American friends, including, Hemingway, etc., immediately cut him off. They said, how can you write positively about this man? And look, the really remarkable thing is that Steinbeck's book, Grapes of Wrath especially, is really about a climate crisis, It's really about environmental degradation. And if you read the first chapter of that book, you'll see it's entirely about environment and climate. So he was a real visionary.
You just spoke about the Western reception to the political novels that are emerging from this part of the world,
Yeah, this part, Africa also.
Africa as well. And yet you have somebody named Milan Kundera, whose political novels they found immense space and acclaim in the Western world. Am I correct? What accounts for it? Again, you see some kind of hypocrisy here?
It's again completely to do with geopolitics.
Right.
That's really what it was, because he was writing critically about
the Soviet regime, yeah.
Soviet regime, about socialism and so on. So then he came to be really acclaimed because, and now who reads Kundera? Completely forgotten. Because the day the Soviet regime disintegrated, I remember saying to myself back then, who will read Kundera anymore?
No.
And nobody does. He's just vanished. The degree to which geopolitics frames taste is something that, I really discovered in the time that I lived in America. Their tastes are completely formed by geopolitics. The American literary world, to an astonishing degree, is completely integrated with the geopolitical regime, you might say.
I have one more question here before I move on to the other section. It just emerged from what we are discussing right now. You spoke about the Western approach toward the subcontinental literature, and you gave that example of Jamison and National Allegory. How do you then see the approach of the Indian English writers towards literature written in Indian languages? Do you see there is a similar tendency here? They also tend to summarily dismiss writings that are appearing in Indian languages that do not necessarily get translated?
I don't think it's the same across the board, because certainly from my experience of Delhi, I know that in Delhi, the writers who wrote in English and the writers who wrote in Hindi, like Nirmal, they had no dialogue, as it were. They lived in separate worlds. Calcutta is very different. In Calcutta, all the major writers were good friends of mine. I would talk to them all the time. Shunilda influenced my work, and he acknowledged my work a lot, in turn. So I think there's a real difference, I think. I would say the same is probably true of Tamil and Malayalam. But in this part of India, especially in the Hindi-speaking world, I think there's a huge gap between those who write in Hindi and those who write in English. But I don't think this is true of Marathi, Malayalam, Tamil, Bangla. All of us have very close... a lot of this also grows out of personal connections, and certainly I had, not so much anymore, but back then I had close personal... Moshitadi was like a dear friend, I was very, very fond of her, and everywhere I would see her. So I think there's a huge difference. And it's true. I think one of the most damaging things that happened was when Salman Rushdie wrote that famous thing saying,
that 50th, that I was coming to that volume.
Yeah.
The volume that he edited on the 50th anniversary of independent India. And if I recall correct, except Satyajit Ray and Manto, no other writer of Indian language found any place. And even these two, they were given just 3 or 4 or 5 pages.
I remember at that time, Nirmal and many others, how profoundly hurt they were by this. In any case, that judgment is based upon a completely erroneous idea of what literature is. Literature is not like science, so that, there's one advance follows another advance. What a ridiculous way to think about writing. Literature is formed by taste. And taste is, taste can be local, it can be regional, it can be different. That's why we read different literatures. You don't read Russian literature because it's more in advance of one thing or another. It's because it expresses a certain kind of, historical experience. I mean, I just think that this whole idea that, you can rank literature according to who is more in advance of whatever. So, when Gitanjali Shri won the Booker Prize, I was so happy. I said to her, at last you have sort of really destroyed this idea. But, before Gitanjali also there were so many writers who were also, I mean, if your criterion is that kind of experimentation, if you like, which doesn't necessarily appeal to me, but if that is what your criterion of advancement is, then Sri Lal Shukla was doing it so long
Exactly.
ago. So many others also, so many Malayalam writers were also doing it. So, I mean, really, I think it was an immense disservice to.
That it.
Yeah.
I come to the next section. You are a powerful critique of the colonial empire and the promise of modernity it brought along. In fact, you ask a question, unsettling question: does modernity have an end point? Can there be a stage when it can be declared, look, we are now completely modern. We do not need the Western model anymore. Can you elaborate upon this?
More than modernity, I would say it's this idea of progress. The idea that progress is this, something that you're always reaching towards, that you're always. I mean, this is such a destructive idea, because in the name of progress, the kinds of horrors that have been visited upon the world, it's just really, it's really shocking. And, well, with modernity as well, we see so many. It's only now, say, because of climate change, that we are suddenly becoming aware of how destructive, that model of so-called development was. That it created ways of life that are completely unsustainable and that will collapse. And we are now seeing the ongoing collapse of those models, which was the pinnacle of modernity. It was California, no?
Right.
California is the place of promise, where the promise of modernity is realized. And now we see California going up in flames.
Yeah. I remember you have mentioned in the book that when Hurricane Katrina struck America, the mightiest empire, the country of the world, it was clueless about how to handle it.
Completely clueless.
And 20 years later, incidentally, your prophecy has come true again, that now Los Angeles is being ravaged by the wildfires and they have no answer to that.
What is happening to Los Angeles is not only predictable, it was predicted. In my own book, Gun Island,
Right.
I have this scene where there's a wildfire coming towards the Getty Museum. And that actually happened, But I wrote that scene many months before it actually happened.
Right.
It was one of those uncanny things that happen. In fact, there's this website called Juggernaut. I don't know if you know. They've just published an article saying how I predicted what happened in Los Angeles. But actually, it's not. You don't need much to predict that. There's a wonderful writer called Mike Davis. He was a left-wing sort of critic. He wrote an amazing book called Ecology of Fear, where he shows you really that California, the thing about the Californian ecology is that it's completely unpredictable. And it swings from one catastrophic extreme to the other. So incredible downpours of rain and incredible periods of drought. And this is a recurring cycle, and it's been intensified by climate change. So, this is the problem really, that what they're already trying to do. I mean, I just saw today on television that developers have already started approaching those people who owned those houses, for example, in Altadena, and they're trying to buy up those houses so that they can build even bigger developments there. This is the real derangement. It's the derangement of America that, especially in the last since the COVID pandemic, there's been an incredible movement towards the most unsustainable places. Miami, California, the Californian coast, also Arizona, New Mexico. These places which are essentially unsustainable because the Colorado River is drying up.
Right, right.
And they're all completely dependent on the Colorado River. So, what you're seeing now is just a model of what I call derangement.
Derangement. It doesn't figure in the policy manifestos at all, hardly any. I come to another section. To me personally, the most engaging part of this book is your conversation with Deepesh Chakravarti. Incredible exchange. I learned that it was published elsewhere earlier,
long time ago.
but I had not read it, so forgive me for my ignorance. But these are very powerful exchanges. The mails that you have exchanged in just a span of, I think, 15 days only in December 2020. I want to...
No, it was 2000.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry,
1999,
December 2000. I want to underline one instance, very moving instance to me at least, when you write about your father, that he served in the British Army and he only had glorious tales about his life there. And towards the end of his life, in the 1990s or so, one day he suddenly started disclosing bit by bit about the horrors, about the discrimination he had faced, as if all those nightmares that he had concealed with him, suddenly they emerged out. I want you to elaborate on that. What might have prompted it?
That exchange with Deepesh, it took place just before the publication of my book, The Glass Palace. And in order to write The Glass Palace, I did extensive interviews with, the INA survivors. I think I was perhaps the last person to interview Colonel Harbaksh Singh Dhillon, he was one of the INA 3, Gurbaksh Singh Dhillon, yeah. And I spent a lot of time talking to him, understanding. I think if you read, one of the critical moments of Indian history, which is very little written about, is exactly the INA and what was going through the minds of those people who had been fighting for the British Empire, And then suddenly upon the field of battle, they see themselves, in a completely new light. Because look at these soldiers, they're young soldiers. They think they've chanced upon this world of privilege because they've become officers. But in Singapore, when they go into the clubs and they want to go into the swimming pool, all the white people leave, because there's a very powerful color bar over there, So suddenly they begin to wake up to the fact that privilege hasn't protected them in any way, There's one article, there's one piece in this book which particularly highlights, that element of what you might call the sepoy sensibility, which is that of, a doctor from Burma coming over the mountains. So I've talked, in that piece about how Indians remember that march and how Westerners remember that march, because there are several Western accounts of it. And the Western accounts of it are all about like battle against nature and all that. How difficult it is, because it was incredibly difficult. The Indian accounts of it are always partly about battle against nature, but partly also about the battle against the British, because they were sent to they had to take the longer routes. They had to, there was so many kinds of discrimination along the way. And I think this is something which, I myself would not have perhaps recognized, as I say in my exchange with Deepesh, if it were not for my experience of living in, predominantly black neighborhood in New York. You suddenly begin to understand that we in India really always have tried to not confront the fundamental reality of race in the building of the British Empire.
Right. What might have prompted it that we couldn't confront it, like the case with your own family, your own father, as you outlined? Why we stopped shying of confronting the racial element?
You know, I think it's a lot to do with the caste system. You know, most of the people who are involved in this
Right.
tend to be upper caste or from privileged castes and so on. So for them to suddenly recognize that, you know, they are,
Point, yeah,
that in the
right,
wider
right.
scheme of things,
Right.
they're not on top at all. That they are also, you know, really, you know, on the racial scheme of things, there's no difference between, you know, a Brahmin and a Dalit.
And the Dalit, right.
You know, I think that for them was a very, very difficult realization.
To accept as well to themselves.
And you'll see that this is why the experience of studying abroad often has this incredible radicalizing effect upon Indians. You know, Indians, I'm saying Indian in a general sense, but also Pakistanis, etc. Because suddenly, you know, the people who go to study there tend to be privileged people. And suddenly they discover that, you know, that those racial barriers apply irrespective of your privilege. So, for example, just to give you a recent example, around this H-1B visas in the United States, it's been so interesting to see, you know, Indians are now the wealthiest community in the United States, wealthiest, most privileged. But suddenly they discover now that that doesn't get them over the racial barrier at all. You know, they discover to their utter surprise. And it makes you want to laugh. I mean, what did they think?
Before I come to this question again, I'll just want to underline, which again you have mentioned in the book, it occurred to me recently, that except a few handful of Bengali writers, not many had this anguish about the racial discrimination by the British rule. Even Gora, if I recall, you have mentioned this, it doesn't have that anguish.
I think it does, though. I mean, Gora is a very tormented character. You know, no, I think Tagore was one of those who understood, you know, because he is also, you know, so hyper-privileged, you know, with wealth on the one hand and everything else. I think
it's difficult to understand, to experience that racial discrimination if you are at that strata of the society. You seem to imply that.
That's right. It's something to do with that. But certainly, I do think that Tagore certainly had a sense of it, but Bunkim even more so, I think. You know, especially if you see Bunkim's rhetorical exchanges, polemical exchanges with various British writers. He's very interesting on these subjects. Tilak as well.
I'll now come to the last question, which occurred to me when you were speaking about the experience of Indians who go to study abroad. You have written in the book that while Oxford was the most fun place to be with, your own university in Delhi, that is Delhi University, was far more intellectually stimulating. Am I correct?
Yes.
Please explain that. I want to know more about that.
Well, you know, this was the extraordinary thing. I mean...
this is early 80s or late 70s of Delhi University?
Mid to late 70s.
Mid to late 70s.
Delhi University at that moment in time was an incredibly intellectually exciting place. Incredibly exciting. Ramu Gandhi was there. JPS Oberoi, who recently died, was there. Veena Das. I'm just talking about a few of those figures. But there were so many of them. And, you know, to be there, Ashish Nandi was very much, you know,
Dharma Kumar.
Our guru. Dharma Kumar, not so much. There were economists are different. You know, we won't talk about economists. But they were, you know, these figures were there. And I mean, it was incredibly stimulating and exciting to hang around them. I mean, you know, Ramu Gandhi would sit under the tree outside the India Coffee House, you know, in the university, and we would all gather around him and listen to him talk. And I mean, you know, he was just showing you things in a different way.
You were in Stephens then?
Yes, yes. But after that also, when I was at the Delhi school, so he was one such figure. J.P.S. Oberoi again was a completely brilliant man who, would suddenly just completely upend your way of seeing the world. Same was true of, let's say, Veena Das and Ashish Nandi. Again, was such a powerful intellectual figure, and they were then in their heyday, so they were such inspiring and interesting figures. There was no one like that was at Oxford. And in any case, because we were, I don't know, because of their influence, I found that I was reading a lot and, reading everything that I could find. And when I got to Oxford, it was, it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed my time there. But certainly, in terms of intellectual stimulation, Delhi University was much better. And that's what makes me so sad about what's happened, to the universities now.
Wow.
Because really, these were world-class places. And, now they're being systematically destroyed. And it just makes you realize that, it's very easy to tear something down. But to build it is so very difficult.
So difficult. So looking back, it's incredible, unbelievable that just 4 decades before, as you mentioned, we have people like Ramu Gandhi, Veena Das, Ashish Nandi, who were among the finest in the world. And still they were young, just in their early 40s or so.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we have lost the generation altogether, those institutions altogether.
That's right. That's right. As I said, it's very easy to destroy institutions. It's very difficult to build them up. It's a really, really sad thing.
Well, one shouldn't end an interview and a conversation on a sad note, but perhaps such are our times. Thank you so much, Amitav. Thank you so much for this stimulating conversation.